get something straight. When an avoidant pulls away, when they go silent, when they suddenly seem cold or distant, it's not always because they've lost interest. In fact, in many cases, it's the exact opposite. The withdrawal isn't a sign of emotional emptiness. It's a sign of emotional overload. It's not rejection. It's self-preservation. See, the avoidant doesn't run from you. They run from themselves, from the intensity of what they feel but don't know how to process. Most people assume love is expressed through closeness, words, affection, or consistency. And while that's true for securely attached individuals, avoidants don't follow the same emotional map. Their nervous system interprets closeness not as comfort, but as danger. Why? Because closeness to them isn't just intimacy, it's exposure. And exposure is vulnerability. For the avoidant, being emotionally naked is terrifying. It means letting someone see the wounds they've hidden for years, maybe decades. So when they start catching real feelings, their first instinct is not to embrace you, it's to retreat. Here's the paradox. The deeper the feelings, the greater the retreat. And that's what most people misunderstand. They think the distance means they've done something wrong or that the connection wasn't real. But what's actually happening is an emotional short circuit. The avoidant feels themselves getting pulled into something genuine. The walls they spent years building are being threatened. And their entire identity, which was once rooted in independence and control, begins to shake. Imagine a person who has trained their whole life to survive a storm by building shelter after shelter, and suddenly they're being asked to step outside to trust the sky. Love for them is not rain, it's a lightning bolt. It lights them up and burns them at the same time. And so they hide, not because you're wrong, but because the connection is too right, too intense, too intimate, too unpredictable. It demands something of them they've spent a lifetime avoiding, emotional surrender. Now, that doesn't mean you should tolerate emotional unavailability. It doesn't mean you accept breadcrumbs or excuse poor communication. But it does mean understanding what's actually going on behind the scenes. Because emotional avoidance is not apathy. It's an adaptive strategy. And most avoidants learned early in life that love equals pressure, rejection, or pain. So they taught themselves to detach, to value autonomy over intimacy, to fear enmeshment more than they fear loneliness. But then someone comes along, you perhaps, and suddenly the script breaks. Suddenly they're feeling things they can't compartmentalize. And that's when you'll see it, the back and forth, the confusion, the mixed signals. It's not a game. It's a psychological tug of war. Their heart wants to connect, but their nervous system sounds the alarm. And here's where it gets even more profound. The avoidant often doesn't even understand what's happening inside them. They don't consciously know they're in love. They just feel overwhelmed, irritated, restless. They may even blame you for those feelings because the intensity you awaken threatens the identity they've used to survive. This is why their withdrawal is not a betrayal, it's a blueprint. It's the first sign that their emotional defenses are cracking. You're getting close, too close. And the moment they realize you can actually matter, that's when they pull away the hardest. But pay attention, real love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a storm. Confusing, chaotic, misdirected. And with avoidance, love is often expressed through what looks like silence, distance, or even avoidance itself. You are not witnessing a lack of emotion. You are witnessing someone drowning in emotion without the tools to swim. And so they hide, but they don't forget. They don't disconnect. They ruminate, replay, regret. They feel everything. They just process it in solitude. So if you're dealing with someone avoidant and you feel them pull away after a moment of closeness, don't rush to blame yourself. And don't immediately assume they never cared. Their disappearance might not mean the love is gone. It might mean it's just beginning. Because the first sign an avoidant is secretly in love isn't when they say it, it's when they run. Not because you're wrong for them, but because for the first time in a long time, something feels right. And that scares the hell out of them. Sometimes the deepest love isn't loud, it's afraid. You want to know if an avoidant is secretly in love? Don't listen to their words, watch their eyes. Their eyes will betray what their mouth is too afraid to say. Because avoidants are masterful at disguising their emotions with logic, control, and distance. But the moment you catch them off guard, the moment they think you're not paying attention, their gaze tells a truth they haven't even admitted to themselves. This is the paradox of emotional avoidance. They run from intimacy, but they crave it. They shut down in conversation, but their eyes linger just a second too long. They look away when you speak from the heart, not because they're cold, but because they feel too much. The gaze becomes the one place they haven't figured out how to wear a mask. And if you know how to read it, it's louder than any confession. Think about the nature of eye contact. It's one of the most primal nonverbal connections we share as human beings. It predates language. It's how infants bond with their caregivers. It's how we silently say, I see you, and I let myself be seen. For the avoidant, that level of transparency is terrifying. When they make eye contact with someone they care about, it feels like standing naked in front of a mirror, vulnerable, exposed, real. That's why they often break eye contact when something intimate is said. It's not disrespect, it's not detachment, it's defense. Because if they look too long, their internal walls start to crumble. And whether they realize it or not, their nervous system interprets that as a threat. Love becomes the trigger, their own feelings become the danger. But when they think you're not looking, something strange happens. They watch you, not just casually, but with intensity, deep, studying glances. They memorize your face, the way you laugh, the way you look away when you're nervous. It's not infatuation. It's not superficial attraction. It's a silent obsession rooted in emotional depth they don't know how to express. What makes this even more fascinating is the psychology behind avoidant behavior. Avoidants often experience conditional love growing up. Maybe they learned that emotions weren't safe, that expressing need would be met with rejection, shame, or punishment. So they adapted. They learned to regulate emotion internally, privately, while keeping their external demeanor controlled and detached. But the problem is, no matter how hard they try, emotions still leak. And the eyes are the biggest leak of all. Let me give you an example. An avoidant partner may dismiss your emotional conversation with, it's not a big deal, or you're overthinking it. But while they say those words, they can't hold your gaze, or their pupils dilate, or their brow furrows ever so slightly. These are unconscious physiological cues that reveal emotional investment. That's the mind saying one thing and the body confessing another. You don't need a lie detector. You just need to stop hearing and start seeing. This is where emotional intelligence becomes critical. It's easy to get discouraged by an avoidant's words, but emotional maturity means learning to observe patterns, not just listen to language. When someone's behavior contradicts their speech, believe the behavior. If an avoidant consistently withdraws after emotional moments, if they go quiet when things get intimate, but you catch them gazing at you like they're reading a book they never want to end, that's not indifference, that's unspoken love. And this is where so many people get confused. They expect love to be obvious, loud, affirming, but with avoidance, love often comes wrapped in silence, delivered in stolen glances, hidden in the way they can't not look at you when you're not looking back. There's also a deeper philosophical layer here. Love, in its purest form, is about being seen and accepted. For the avoidant, that's the one thing they've feared their entire life, and also the one thing they've longed for. So when they start to fall for someone, when real emotions start to take root, their gaze becomes a window into that internal conflict. I want to run, but I want to stay. I want to hide, but I want you to see me. And they do want to be seen, but only by someone who sees through the noise. Someone who doesn't need constant affirmations but can detect the truth in a moment of silence. Someone who understands that real love isn't always spoken, it's often shown, subtly, deeply, in the spaces between the words. So if you're wondering whether that avoidant person feels something for you, watch their eyes when you speak your truth. Watch how they fumble for composure. Watch how quickly they look away when emotion rises in the room. That's not rejection. That's resistance to how deeply they're starting to care. Because love, when it terrifies someone, doesn't show up in their voice. It shows up in their gaze. And if you catch it, don't ignore it. That look may be the most honest thing they've ever given you. Here's where things get really interesting and deeply misunderstood. One of the most paradoxical signs that an avoidant is secretly in love with you is this. They push you away, and then they check if you're still there. They go quiet, then suddenly resurface. They act distant, then peek into your world through social media, mutual friends, or subtle cues. On the surface, it looks inconsistent, confusing, even manipulative. But underneath that erratic behavior is something very real and very conflicted. Avoidants don't test you in the traditional sense. They're not playing games in the way someone insecure might consciously play games. What they're doing is trying to navigate an inner world that feels emotionally unsafe. Love triggers a threat response inside them. It's not rational, it's neurological. The nervous system interprets intimacy as danger, not because you are dangerous, but because closeness means vulnerability. And vulnerability to someone with an avoidant attachment style has historically equated to pain, rejection, or a loss of control. So what do they do when those feelings start to grow? They retreat. They withdraw to regain a sense of safety. They need space, not because they don't care, but because they care too much. And their system doesn't know how to regulate that. But here's the critical piece. After they've pulled back, they can't help but check if you're still there. It's not because they're trying to manipulate you. It's because they're afraid they've lost you. Their love shows up in their monitoring of your presence. You might notice it through little things. They disappear for a few days and then suddenly watch your story. They don't respond to a message, but they like an old photo. They make no move to talk, but they ask a mutual friend how you've been. And that's not a coincidence. That's not apathy. That's surveillance driven by emotional anxiety, masked, of course, as disinterest. What's fascinating here is that avoidants crave reassurance in a way they'll never directly ask for. They'll never say, do you still love me, or are you going to leave? Because those questions require vulnerability they haven't yet made peace with. Instead, they distance themselves and then indirectly check to see if you'll follow, chase, or react. Your silence becomes the test, not because they want to play with your mind, but because it triggers their core fear, abandonment. And ironically, that fear only surfaces when they actually love you. The pattern is subtle but powerful. Pull back, peek in. Push away, then hover. It's emotional whiplash if you don't know what you're looking at. But when you understand the psychology, it becomes clear. This is how the avoidant tries to stay connected while maintaining their illusion of control. They want you close, but not too close. They fear losing you, but fear even more what it means to fully have you. This dance of distance and proximity, retreat and curiosity, is the hallmark of a conflicted heart. And the more pronounced it is, the more emotionally significant you are to them. They don't do this with people they're indifferent toward. They do this with the ones who matter, the ones who trigger something deeper than attraction, something that threatens the story they've told themselves for years, that they don't need anyone, that love is dangerous, that connection will always cost them their identity. And here's the truth most people never hear. When an avoidant starts to exhibit this hot and cold behavior, it's not the sign that love is fading. It's the sign that love is trying to break through. It means you've hit a nerve. You've touched something real. And now their system is trying to figure out how to survive it without shutting down completely. So what do you do when this happens? You don't chase and you don't beg. You stand firm in your work. You don't punish them, but you don't rescue them either. You let your presence speak louder than your pursuit. Because avoidants don't fall in love with people who try to fix them. They fall in love with people who see them and hold their ground. This isn't about playing hard to get. It's about understanding the emotional terrain you're walking on. They pull away not to destroy the connection, but to test if it's safe to return. And when they check to see if you're still there, what they're really asking is, can I trust you not to abandon me if I come back vulnerable? So if you're in this situation, don't just react to the retreat. Recognize it for what it is. A cry for safety disguised as distance. And when they check if you're still there, remember, it's not because they don't care. It's because caring terrifies them. There's a truth about avoidance that no one talks about because it flips everything we've been conditioned to believe about connection. It's this: the more space you give them, the more they begin to crave your presence. It sounds counterintuitive, even absurd, especially if you're someone who's used to building relationships through closeness, through consistency, through constant communication, but the avoidant mind doesn't operate like that. For them, closeness is pressure, and pressure activates defense. When you pull back, not to punish, not to play games, but to center yourself, they start to feel something they rarely feel with anyone else: safe. Avoidants are wired to interpret emotional intimacy as a loss of autonomy. They grew up, more often than not, in environments where dependency felt dangerous. Maybe their emotional needs were met with rejection, maybe with volatility, or worse, with complete indifference. So they learned early, the less I need, the less I hurt. They built an identity around independence, and when someone comes too close, that identity feels like it's under attack. Not because the person is wrong, but because intimacy triggers old survival mechanisms. Their reflex is to run, to shut down, to emotionally evacuate. But here's where it gets interesting. When you, the person they've started to develop real feelings for, stop pushing, stop chasing, stop trying to fix or explain, they're left alone with themselves. And in that silence, something shifts. They're no longer defending against your pursuit. There's nothing to resist. And now the real question hits them: do I actually miss this person? And for the first time, without pressure clouding their thinking, they begin to feel the answer. The answer often is yes, but it doesn't surface in fireworks. It comes slowly, like a creeping awareness. They start noticing the lack of your voice, the absence of your energy, the emotional space you once held in their life. What used to feel like suffocation now starts to feel like emptiness. And that shift is where love begins to take root. You see, avoidants don't fall in love through constant attention. They fall in love through safe distance, through knowing they can breathe and still feel connected, through realizing that your presence in their life doesn't mean a prison, but a choice, that you're not there to consume them, fix them, or demand from them, but to witness them. And that witnessing becomes irresistible. And here's what most people get wrong. They think space kills connection. But with avoidance, space is what allows connection to deepen. Not because you're withdrawing love, but because you're respecting boundaries. And boundaries to an avoidant are not walls, they're oxygen. They are the first sign that this love might actually be survivable. Now let's be clear, this isn't about withholding affection or playing emotional chess. It's not about silence as a strategy. It's about stepping back with integrity. It's about saying, I care about you, but I won't abandon myself to prove it. That energy is what creates trust. That energy is what dismantles fear, and that energy is what turns resistance into reflection. When an avoidant starts to feel that your love is in a trap, when they realize you're not demanding a piece of them they're not ready to give, they begin to relax. And that relaxation opens the door to vulnerability. Suddenly their inner world isn't under attack, it's being honored. And in that safety, their desire for you grows. Not out of neediness, not out of fear of loss, but out of choice. Real, conscious, powerful choice. That's when they start to re-engage. Slowly, tentatively. You may get a message, a memory shared, a question about your day. Not grand gestures, just signals. Signals that say, I'm beginning to feel safe enough to come closer. And if you meet that with presence, not pressure, you're not just building a connection. You're building trust in someone who spent their whole life protecting themselves from exactly that. So many people sabotage their chances with avoidance by trying to prove themselves, by staying available 24/7, by emotionally overinvesting in someone who hasn't yet earned that investment. But the truth is, the more you self-abandon, the more avoidance feels suffocated. And the more you honor your space, your boundaries, your peace, the more magnetic you become to someone who never thought love could feel that free. Sometimes, the most powerful way to pull someone in is to stop pulling at all. If you really want to know whether an avoidant is secretly in love with you, look past the silence, past the distance, past the way they sometimes seem emotionally unreachable, and pay attention to the details they remember. Because here's what most people miss. Avoidants may not express love through grand romantic gestures or poetic confessions, but they notice everything that matters. Their memory becomes their form of intimacy, and what they remember, that's where their heart is hiding. This is where we have to separate emotional expression from emotional investment. Just because someone doesn't say, I love you, doesn't mean they don't feel it. In the case of an avoidant, the emotional expression is constrained by fear, but the emotional awareness is heightened. They observe you more than you realize. They're tuned into the details. They listen between the lines. And while they may not respond in real time, they're collecting data. Not as manipulation, but as quiet evidence of attachment. You'll notice this in small moments. Maybe you casually mentioned your favorite dessert once, and weeks later they bring it up out of nowhere. Maybe you thought they weren't listening when you shared something vulnerable, but then they reference it in a future conversation. Maybe you forgot a specific date or story, but they didn't. They archived it. Not out of obligation, but because it meant something to them. Their memory becomes a map of their emotional world. One they keep private, but one that speaks volumes if you know how to read it. Avoidants operate with internal systems. That means they process feelings inwardly and rarely in the moment. While a securely attached person might immediately say, that made me feel close to you, the avoidant will feel it, bury it, analyze it, and only later allow it to surface, often in an unexpected or indirect way. But make no mistake, they are emotionally impacted. And the more they remember, the more emotionally attached they are. There's a psychological reason for this. Avoidants, often having grown up in emotionally unpredictable environments, learn to be hyper vigilant. They had to track the mood in the room, the tone of voice, the shifts in expression, not because they were trying to be thoughtful, but because it was a survival strategy. That hypervigilance becomes part of how they love, not by declaring it, but by noticing, by logging the small things, by remembering what makes you feel safe, or what lights you up, or what makes you go quiet. And here's where it gets deep. For someone who's afraid to love, remembering you becomes the safest way to keep you. They may not text every day. They may not initiate emotional conversations, but they remember, because remembering gives them a way to stay connected without feeling exposed. They replay your conversations. They think about that one moment you laughed and didn't realize they were watching. They carry you not in their schedule, but in their subconscious. This can be difficult for people who expect love to look a certain way. If you're waiting for consistent messages, daily affirmations, or over-the-top validation, you may misinterpret their quiet memory as disinterest. But the truth is, their memory is their love language. It's not loud, it's not obvious, but it's deeply intentional. They don't remember everyone's details, only the ones who matter, only the ones who shake the armor loose. And this is where so many relationships go sideways, because people misread the avoidant silence as emptiness, when really it's full of unspoken thought. The more emotionally significant you are to them, the more they'll retreat to process it. And yet, paradoxically, the more they'll remember about you, it's the safest way for them to stay bonded without triggering the fear of engulfment. You want to know if they care? Watch what they remember. It won't always make sense, and it won't always come with a smile. But if they recall a small moment that even you forgot, that's not random. That's resonance. That's emotion finding a safe place to exist inside the mind of someone who doesn't yet know how to say it out loud. So don't just listen for the words. Pay attention to the echoes, the callbacks, the seemingly minor memories that were anything but minor to them. For avoidance, remembering is not just sentiment, it's survival. And sometimes it's the only way they know how to love without feeling like they're risking everything. Because when someone remembers the parts of you you've long forgotten, that's not casual. That's connection in its most sacred, hidden form. You want to know when the avoidant truly starts to unravel? It's not when you're texting them. It's not when you're calling, trying to connect, trying to get answers. It's when you go silent, when you stop showing up, when your energy pulls back and your presence fades from their day-to-day reality. That's when the avoidant, the one who spent so much time avoiding vulnerability, suddenly finds themselves face to face with the one thing they've tried to escape their whole life, feeling. Avoidants operate in control. Emotional distance is their comfort zone. It gives them the illusion that they are safe, protected, impenetrable. But your silence breaks that illusion. Not because you're playing games, but because you've stepped out of the dynamic. You've stopped dancing around their fears. And now the noise they tried so hard to avoid, it's happening inside of them. This is the part people don't see. The avoidant may appear unbothered on the outside. They go on with their life, they post, they distract, they act like nothing's changed. But internally, the silence echoes. They start to replay the moments. Not just the arguments or the awkward pauses, but the small, tender moments. The laugh you shared. The way you understood them without needing explanation. The calm you brought to their chaos. And the irony? They often don't realize how deep the connection ran until it's quiet. Until your voice isn't there. Until the late night texts stop. Until there's no one checking in. That stillness forces them inward. And that's the very thing they've tried to avoid their whole lives. Introspection, feeling, confronting their own emotional attachment. Avoidants are not immune to pain. They're not heartless or cold. They're guarded. But when the person they secretly care about goes silent, not with anger, but with self-respect, that guard starts to crack. Because your silence isn't just absence, it's a mirror. It forces them to look at what they've pushed away. And what they often find is discomfort, confusion, longing, and yes, love. And here's the psychology behind it. Most avoidants have learned to regulate distress through withdrawal. When things get too intense, they pull away to soothe themselves. But when you're no longer there, they lose the very outlet they were withdrawing from. That coping mechanism short circuits. And now they're stuck with the very emotion they were trying to avoid, grief. But not the grief of loss, the grief of realization that they cared and that they didn't know how to handle it. Here's what separates someone who's playing games from someone who's emotionally evolving. When they feel that grief, it becomes a choice point. Will they retreat further into their shell, or will they finally step forward into something uncomfortable but real? Your silence creates that opportunity. It's not about making them chase. It's about making space for the truth to rise. The truth is, love requires reflection. especially for someone who's built their entire identity on independence and emotional control. And sometimes the only thing powerful enough to initiate that reflection is the absence of what they thought they could live without. So if you're in this position and you're wondering if they care, don't just look at their reaction. Look at the shift. Are they reaching out in subtle ways? Are they suddenly reactive to your silence? Are they resurfacing, not with clarity perhaps, but with curiosity, with questions, with hesitation masked as small talk? That's not indifference. That's discomfort turning into recognition. You didn't lose them when you went silent. You gave them a chance to find themselves. And in that space, if there's any real emotional attachment, it begins to surface. Not always cleanly, not always quickly, but undeniably. Because what rattles the avoidant more than anything isn't confrontation, it's the quiet knowing that you're gone, not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring for yourself. And in that decision, you became something they didn't expect, a mirror of what they secretly wanted, but didn't know how to hold on to. So when you go silent, you're not ending the story. You're rewriting the script. One where love isn't built on chasing or convincing, but on presence, reflection, and choice. And sometimes your greatest power isn't in what you say, but in what you no longer need to explain. Tools.